I played and reviewed every single NES racing game I have to see if they're worth returning to in the modern day. If there's any genre that seems like it could only get better with time, it's racing, right? The more realistic the physics are, the better the car models are, the better the overall experience is for the player, because racing games are meant to simulate racing, correct? I'd argue that's not the case. Racing games, as obvious as this may seem, are meant to make a game out of the experience of racing. As in, they're supposed to use the elements that are associated with racing in the real world and then create a satisfying gameplay experience from those elements. This may not necessarily result in a product that perfectly emulates what racing is like in real life. A great example of this is 8-bit racing games. With that being said, all too often I hear people say, so-and-so old game is so worth returning to and it totally holds up. And then when you play it, you see, maybe it's just their nostalgia talking. Which is valid, obviously. There are tons of games I love really only because of nostalgia. But to someone without that nostalgia, that value may not carry over. So what I did today is I ranked 7 8-bit NES racing games on 5 categories that I think will ultimately tell us whether or not these games are worth returning to for someone who is just maybe interested in retro games, and that is the only assumption I'm making about them. Each one of these elements is rated on a scale from 0 to 2 with half points available, and at the end we'll get a rating out of 10. The first 2 I feel are pretty explanatory: gameplay and art. We all know what those are. Art includes music and visuals. Then world/plot incorporates story, the world building, as well as the gameplay loop. All of these things factor into that score. Interest is the next category, which is kind of an X factor category. Just how unique is this game? Is this game maybe historically significant in some way? Does this game have some sort of catering to niche interests? And then lastly is accessibility, which pertains to how many concessions are you going to have to make to go back and play this old game. For example, a lot of these games don't have save states. That would factor into their accessibility score. For this scale, anything above a 5 I think is probably worth returning to for some people. A 7 to probably an 8 maybe would be appealing to really anyone who likes retro games. And then an 8.5 and up, which are going to be rare in this scale, are games that maybe even transcend that retro label and hold up to really anybody. So, with that all being said, let's get into the first game. Al Unser Jr.'s Turbo Racing. I have no idea who Al Unser Jr. is outside of this little game. His digitized likeness is here, so I kind of know what he looks like. Google tells me that he is a race car driver who's won the Indy 500 twice. For gameplay, I gave Al Unser Jr.'s Turbo Racing a 0.5 out of 2. It is very standard scalar gameplay. These races are way too long. When I started the career mode, the first lap of the race took me 3 minutes, and there were 5 laps. 5 laps. I can barely get through like a 5-minute race in a modern racing game. I am not doing a 15-minute race of an 8-bit scalar. Like, that's wild. As for art, I gave this game a 1.5 out of 2. The visuals legitimately did impress me. The sprites are big and they look nice. The music's fine. It didn't really stand out to me in any way, but the fact that there is music at all does kind of stand out, as we'll see as we get into this. And like I briefly touched on before, there is the digitized likeness of Al Unser Jr. and probably some other racers that I didn't see or pick up on, but that's always fun. It's always nice to see a super crunchy JPEG in an NES game. For world and plot, I gave this game a 1.5 out of 2, which honestly is maybe a little generous, but it had qualifying races, which I thought was really cool. There is a full career mode to play here if you're willing to sink that amount of time into it. For interest, I gave this a 0.5 out of 2. It really does not stand out in any way from other scalars. Just play Outrun or something, which that's not the last time I'm going to say that in this video. But the 0.5 comes from if you're a huge Al Unser Jr. fan, this probably does have some interest for you. Granted, I've never met someone like that, but I'm sure they exist somewhere. For accessibility, I gave this game a 0. For what I alluded to before, no save states, but that's not going to get you a 0. I don't really expect NES games to have save states. What does get this game a 0 is that you have to shift gears as part of the gameplay, and there's no engine noise, which almost makes the game unplayable. You have to look at the bottom of the screen, which is very busy. There's so much happening at the bottom of the screen to see when you're supposed to shift gears because of the little RPM bar. You really need an engine noise to make that kind of gameplay work. Overall, this game gets a 4 out of 10. Like I said, unless you're a big Al Unser Jr. fan, I don't think this game's worth returning to. Next up on the list is Excitebike. This game's so old that the fact that the screen scrolls, that it's not just a single screen, was a huge selling point for it. and was really like a testament to the technology of the time. For gameplay, I gave it a 1.5 out of 2. We all know the gameplay of Excitebike. You're switching lanes either to avoid obstacles or get boosts, and then you go over jumps and kind of tilt your bike to land the jumps properly to get the most momentum and to not fall off and slowly roll down a hill like I did a few times. The art, I gave it a 1 out of 2. It's not anything shocking. It does its job. The environments are, you're in a motocross place, and it looks like that. The music's fine. I really like the jingle for winning races. For world and plot, I gave this game a 2 out of 2. It is just an arcade game. You're just doing time trial after time trial and seeing how far you can get. You really can't mess with that style of gameplay. Like, it works for what it is. For interest, I also gave this game a 2 out of 2 because it is a huge part of not just Nintendo history, but gaming history as a whole. It's a very early side-scroller, and even outside of those elements, it generates interest by being just different than other racing games of the time. It's more like Trials, if you know those games, than really any other racing game on the NES. For accessibility, I gave this a 1.5 out of 2. That 0.5 loss is because of no save states, but I'm not going to fault it too much because, again, it's an arcade game. The controls are very simple, easy to pick up. I think anyone can really understand it. So overall, this game gets an 8 out of 10. I'd pretty heavily recommend it to really anybody who likes retro games, and even people who aren't that interested in retro games. It really is just about kind of timing those jumps, angling yourself, and hitting the boosts. Next up is Ironman Stewart's Super Off-Road. Ironman Stewart is an off-road racer. That's really all I could find about him without watching a podcast. I think the name Ironman might be taken by someone else, but, you know, I guess he can figure that one out for himself. For gameplay, I gave this game a 1.5 out of 2. It is a single screen, I call it a slot racer, very similar to Atari's Sprint, but a little more isometric. The cars are a little bit too small on the screen, which does kind of mess with it. For art, I gave it a 1.5 out of 2. This game has a lot of personality to it. You get to choose a country, who you're racing for, and in between screens, there's like the little podium, and all of the racers are like fully just people. They're obviously very pixelated, but it's very cool. Also, I picked America because I'm from there, and when I won a race, the national anthem played, which was like awesome. That's so fun. I'm not like super patriotic or anything, that's not a political statement, but there is just something about hearing the 8-bit national anthem coming from the NES because you won a silly little racing game that's like so over the top and just fun. For world and plot, I gave this a 2 out of 2. It's another arcade game where you're just going through a whole bunch of levels to see how far you can get. You can buy upgrades between races. You can also pick up money in the races so that you can buy more upgrades. That's just a very satisfying gameplay loop of racing, upgrading your car, going to another race, upgrading your car, all that. The races are also just very quick and fun, and I think that works to this game's advantage. For interest, I gave this game a 1.5 out of 2. In its presentation, it's not super exciting. It's very much like other racing games of the time. I guess there's also some points there if you're an Ironman Stewart fan, but again, never met one. The hazards and boosts here are pretty unique, and they fit well with the theme. Like, while you're racing, there's a lot of little bumps and dips you have to kind of go around because your car will get slowed down by them. You use nitro a lot in this game, and it's mostly just like to acknowledge you're on a straightaway. For accessibility, I gave it a 1 out of 2. First off, it has no saves. Not a huge deal, but just something to consider. It is kind of isometric. It's not the worst kind of isometric where like everything is at an angle. It's more like you're kind of looking straight at it, but from 45 degrees. It does kind of mess with the controls, and if you're not used to that style of gameplay, it is something you're going to have to get used to. So overall, I give Ironman Stewart's Super Off-Road a 7.5 out of 10. I think if you're into retro games, especially if you're into retro racing games, there is fun to be had here. Next up is Rad Racer, as I like to call it. Definitely not Outrun. Also, this game's made by Square. I didn't know that. I've played both this and its sequel before. I had no idea these games are made by Square. That's funny. They're a lot like Final Fantasy. Cloud is there. That's not true. For gameplay, I gave this game a 1.5 out of 2. There is a real sense of speed here. It's the first out of any of these games where I truly felt like I was going fast at times, which is cool. It's cool when older racing games can give you that sense of speed. But it loses 0.5 points because it is very hard and unforgiving. There are some of the tightest turns I've experienced in a scalar racing game. Like, I didn't even know the graphics could allow for turns as tight as this game has. The art, I gave a 1 out of 2. The visuals were fine. They didn't really stand out at all. There was no music, but this game has probably the coolest engine noise out of any of these games. They must have been using like multiple NES tracks to make some sort of weird, almost interference clicking noise, and I've never really heard any other game of the time do that, it was really a cool way to use the NES's sound chip. Funnily enough though, in this game you aren't switching gears, so, the super in-depth engine noises aren't even necessary, but it has them, and they're cool. For world and plot, I gave this game a 1 out of 2. It's cool to see the progress screen at the end of the race, and like how far you got, how many checkpoints you hit. I couldn't get past the first race. I never have in this game, because, like I said, those turns are just so unforgiving. So I couldn't really experience too much of the loop, but it is just an arcade game. You're just going through races, doing them over and over again. Same old, same old. For interest, I gave it a 0.5 out of 2. This game's a clone of Outrun. Just play Outrun. That's really all I can say about it there. And then for accessibility, I give this game a 1 out of 2. It has good auditory feedback for shifting gears, which you don't need to do, but also for turning, it makes it very clear when you're kind of starting to skid and lose traction. Granted, you don't really have time to do anything about that, but it is telling you, which is something. But it loses a point because there are no turn indicators, and in a game where the turns are going to be extreme as they are, you really need a warning about when you have to turn, and there's no map overlay. Either of those things would have helped with some of the extreme turns of this game, and neither were present. And overall, Rad Racer gets a 5 out of 10 score. If you really want a super scaler on your NES, you could do worse, but I don't think it's worth most people's time. However, Rad Racer II. This one's probably going to be pretty quick. I'm mostly just going to go over what's different and what's improved. First off, I gave this gameplay a perfect 2 out of 2. It is just the quintessential scalar racer gameplay. It's significantly more forgiving and more fun than the first Rad Racer. For art, I gave it a 1.5 out of 2. Still no music, but I will say the locations here are definitely more interesting than the first Rad Racer. Admittedly, I only saw one location in the first Rad Racer because it was too hard to get past the first level. But even just comparing the first two areas alone, Rad Racer 2 had better depth, had a just nicer color scheme overall. It just looked better. And of course, the awesome engine noise is still here that I'm a huge fan of. World and plot stayed the same, still 1 out of 2, nothing changed. Still the same game loop. I got to experience it a little bit this time because I could make it to the second level, but it is still the same game loop. Interest, once again, it's a 0.5 out of 2. It's a clone of Outrun, and it is even a sequel to a clone of Outrun. It is the better sequel to a clone of Outrun. I think those all balance out to be a 0.5 out of 2 still. In accessibility, I gave this game a 1.5 out of 2 because it did add turn indication, which is awesome. Overall, I give this game a 6.5 out of 10. If you really want to play Outrun on your NES, this is the closest you're going to get, and it's not a bad option. Next up is RC Pro-Am. Full disclaimer, this is one of my favorite games of all time, probably in like my top 30, which when you've played as many games as me, that means a lot. These reviews will slightly follow my opinion of these games, but they are not 100% my opinion of these games. These are meant to be how comfortable I am recommending these games to other people. RC Pro-Am is a very early Rare game. Rare was on a legendary run of games in general, but specifically racing games during the first 2, even 3 console generations. I'd love to do a video about that sometime, and if that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments. I'd love to do a Rare racing game retrospective. For the gameplay, I gave it a 2 out of 2. RC Pro-Am's awesome. I love the power-ups here. They're like legitimately Mario Kart level power-ups. You can get like missiles and I think shurikens to throw at the RC cars in front of you. And I think they're supposed to be some sort of mine, but they really look like whoopee cushions that you can lay down behind you and they make the other car explode. I like to pretend they're whoopee cushions. And this is kind of like a little more ethereal and harder to put into words, but everything with RC Pro-Am just balances really well. It has some things it doesn't do super well, but the concessions it gives you and the concessions you have to give it just balance out very well and make a satisfying experience, even if it isn't perfect. For art, I gave it a 1.5 out of 2. There's no music in the races. I like the music outside of the races. But in the races, all of the racers have their own sound effects. So like if your opponent hits a boost tile, you'll hear the boost tile sound effect just a little quieter, which is like, yeah, obviously, like that's, why wouldn't a game do that? But when you're an old 8-bit console and you have very limited audio channels to work with, that is a big deal, and it is very cool that they added that. I also just love the car models in this game. They are RC cars. They're very like squashed and cute. I'm a huge fan of it. For world and plot, I give RC Pro-Am a 2 out of 2. It's very similar to Super Off-Road in that you're doing a quick little race and then getting upgrades. What's cool in RC Pro-Am is that you just have to not lose the race to go on. You don't have to come in first, you just have to not come in fourth. I just love picking up the upgrades. I think it's a good balance between, do I take the best line here or do I try to pick up that tire so that my handling's better in the next race. For interest, I give this game a 1.5 out of 2. One, for just being an early Rare game, and, they went on to be a legendary game developer. The RC cars are a fun little addition. I don't think that was super common at this time. There was Micro Machines, but that wasn't even licensed, and I don't have it, so. And I think also, for this kind of semi-top-down, small-scale racing game, this really is the best in that genre at the time. So if you're gonna play one, it should be RC Pro-Am. For accessibility, I give this game a 1 out of 2. Because it has some huge strengths and some huge weaknesses. For the strengths, there are indicators on the map that tell you when a turn's coming up, which way it is. The game even tells you beforehand how many hazards are going to be on the map based on the weather conditions. Speaking of maps, there is a map. There's an overworld map that updates as you go around the track and shows you and your opponent's positions, which is huge. Really, no other racing games from the time that I've played have had that. For the bad parts of the accessibility, this is a fully isometric game. You are fully at a weird angle, so it is really just about controlling the momentum of your car and understanding where your momentum vector is pointing, and that is very confusing for some people who aren't used to this type of game. It is something you will have to kind of learn and get used to, but I think it's worth doing. There's no save states, again, not a huge deal. Probably the biggest issue with this game is that just because of the angle and the size of the screen, you don't really have enough time to always react to what's about to come up. You kind of need to memorize the maps to play to the best of your ability, because if there's a sharp turn, you're not going to know until you have to start turning, pretty much. With all that being said, RC Pro-Am gets an 8 out of 10. Once again, I'd recommend this game really to anyone who likes retro games, especially to anyone who likes racing retro games, and even to people who just like arcade games in general. This does provide a very fun arcadey experience. Alright, lastly, switch your TV to channel 96, because we got Taito Grand Prix on the Famicom. I love Taito as a company. They make some mediocre games. They're not the most exciting all the time, but they always have such a cute and fun charm to them that just really works for me. And look at this, look at this cover, or this cover art. It's just so cool. The car is warping because it's turning so fast. That's sick. That doesn't happen in Forza. For gameplay, I gave this game a 2 out of 2. It's another game with a cool upgrade system. I always appreciate that. And also, the racing just feels really good and forgiving. It maybe doesn't have the speed that I experienced in Rad Racer, but you always feel like you're in control and you feel like you're playing well. Also, this game does feature gear shifting and has the required engine noise to let you know when to do it. For art, I gave this game a 1.5 out of 2. There's no music during races, but there are a lot of sound effects and, again, the needed engine noise, so I'm not going to fault it too much for that. Also, I might have just been doing something wrong, I don't know, because it had a song select before each race, but they didn't do anything. I never heard any music. And the aesthetic inside and outside of races was very nice. The human models that you see are very charming and pleasant to look at. For world and plot, I give this game a perfect 2 out of 2 because it feels the most modern in gameplay loop. You're going to different exhibition matches depending on your car's rank. You start with a D rank car that's very cute. I might add, it looks like a little Mini Cooper. I'm a huge fan of it. And you do races for a certain amount of money. Then you can use that money to either upgrade your car or buy a better car. And then eventually your car will rank up and you can do higher ranks to get more money, more upgrades, so on and so forth. It's basically Need for Speed. It's basically Forza. It's the exact same game, really. The gameplay loop is very cool, and it does seem like the environments are different based on the different areas you go to, which is just awesome. It just makes this game feel like a full world, which is cool, and a lot of these games, didn't feel like that at the time. For interest, I give this game a 1.5 out of 2. It loses a tiny bit of points for, again, kind of feeling a little bit like an Outrun clone, but I think it iterates and differentiates itself enough to not be that. And again, like I said, it just has very innovative gameplay that was very ahead of its time. And for that, I think it is worth looking at and checking out. And then for accessibility, I give this game a 1 out of 2. Its weakness is that it's in a language that isn't English. I didn't even know those existed until about last week. Nah, I'm not playing, obviously. It's in Japanese. There are enough pictures and it's intuitive enough that you kind of can make your way through it without knowing Japanese. But buying some of the upgrades and stuff can be a little confusing because you aren't really sure what they are. They do have numbers, and the numbers are numbers, so I can read those and I can tell, hey, this makes this number go up. I don't know what this number is, but it's a stat, and I probably want it to be higher. It's definitely navigable, but it is rough. It's rough to play this game fully in Japanese. But without that being said, it has save states. This NES racing game from 1987 has save states. That's so awesome. I was shocked. I remember playing this game for the first time, and I was like, oh, this is a really fun and cool gameplay loop. It sucks that it's not going to save and that I have to like essentially beat it all in one go to beat this game. But no, this game saves. This game fully has save states. That's so awesome for an NES racing game. You know, like I can count the amount of NES games that have save states probably on both my hands that I own. Most of those are RPGs. They're not racing games. And so overall, this game gets an 8 out of 10. Another game where I say if you're into retro games, this game's at least worth checking out, especially if you're into racing games and you want one with kind of a more modern feeling gameplay loop. This is your go-to. It's really, truly an awesome game. So, with all that being said, what are our conclusions? Well, first, Taito GP, RC Pro-Am, and surprisingly, Ironman Stewart's Super Off-Road, and Excitebike, of course, are all worth returning to, I'd say, especially if you're into retro games. On a larger scale, I think what this means is we really need to expand how we think of the goals of a racing game. When I'm playing these old like scalar racing games, I almost view them as like a rhythm game where I'm trying to shift gears at the right time, dodge players at the right time, all that kind of stuff. And that works for me. That's genuinely fun. It's, you know, simpler than a lot of newer racer games. That doesn't mean it's bad. That just means it's different, and it's a different mindset you have to be in. Overall, I would love if people opened up their minds a little bit more to what a racing game can be. And I think returning to these old racing games can give us a lot of new perspectives and information to return to the present with and make new cool racing games. I hope you all like and subscribe. Follow me on my other socials. I have a Twitter and TikTok, both also Critter Alex. And yeah, thank you for watching. Let me know what you'd want to see next.